The winter wind cut through the Texas plains like a knife, carrying with it the promise of death for anyone caught unprepared. It was December 1868, and the cold had already claimed 3 lives at Fort Richardson. The wooden buildings creaked and groaned under the weight of ice, while inside, soldiers huddled around small fires, counting the days until spring dawned in a corner of the fort's makeshift barracks lived a young woman who didn't quite belong to either world. Morning Star was 22 years old, with long black hair that she often braided with small beads her grandmother had given her. Her skin was weathered from years on the prairie, but her eyes still held the spark of someone who had once known freedom. 2 years earlier, she had made a choice that changed everything. She had fallen in love with a cavalry soldier named James Mackenzie, a quiet man from Ohio who treated her with kindness when others looked at her with suspicion. Their wedding had been small, held at the fort with only a few witnesses. Her own people had turned their backs on her for marrying a white man, and the soldiers' wives whispered behind her back about the Indian woman living among them. James had been a good husband, gentle and patient. He tried to learn her language, and she taught him the names of plants that could heal wounds and which stars guided travelers home. But the army had other plans for James. In September, they transferred him to a fort 300 miles away, and Morning Star was left behind with their 6-month-old son, little Wolf. The baby was the light of her life. He had his father's blue eyes but her dark hair, and when he smiled, it seemed like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Morning Star would carry him everywhere, talking to him in both English and Comanche, teaching him the songs her mother had sung to her. But as winter deepened, life at the fort became harder. Colonel Samuel Hartwell, the commanding officer, had initially allowed her to stay, but his attitude changed as food became scarce and tensions rose. The other families at the fort made it clear they didn't want her there. They called her that Indian woman when they thought she couldn't hear, and some crossed themselves when she walked by, as if she carried evil spirits. The worst of them was Sergeant William Cross, a thick-set man from Missouri with yellowed teeth and hands that were always dirty. He had fought in battles against various tribes and spoke often about how Indians needed to be driven from Texas completely. Cross would stare at Morning Star with undisguised hatred, and she learned to avoid him whenever possible. Winter tightened its grip on the fort. Supply wagons couldn't get through the snow-blocked trails, and rations were cut in half. The soldiers grew irritable and short-tempered. Some blamed Morning Star for their troubles, saying she was eating food meant for their own families. Others whispered that her presence had brought bad luck to the fort. Morning Star tried to make herself useful. She knew how to find edible roots even in winter, and she could prepare medicines from bark and herbs. But every kindness she offered was met with suspicion. When she brought soup to a sick soldier's wife, the woman threw it out, claiming she wouldn't eat food prepared by savage hands. The baby began to cough in early December. At first it seemed like nothing serious, just the kind of mild illness that all children get. But as the days passed, little Wolf's cough grew worse. His tiny body burned with fever, and he couldn't keep milk down. Morning Star walked the floors of the barracks night after night, holding her son and singing soft lullabies. Trying to comfort him, she went to Dr. Morrison, the fort's physician, begging him to examine her child. The doctor was an older man from Boston who had come west for reasons he never shared. He had kind eyes, but when Morning Star approached him with her sick baby, he looked uncomfortable and told her he was too busy with the soldiers to tend to her child. "Please," she said in her careful English, "he is very sick. I will work for you, clean your office, anything you need." Dr. Morrison looked at the baby, whose breathing was shallow and labored, then glanced around nervously. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "but the colonel has made it clear that my duties are to the soldiers and their families first." Morning Star felt her heart break a little more. She understood what he wasn't saying. In the eyes of the fort, her mixed-blood child didn't matter enough to waste medicine on. She tried everything she knew. She made teas from willow bark to bring down the fever and wrapped the baby in warm furs. She sang the healing songs her grandmother had taught her and prayed to both the Christian God her husband had told her about and the spirits of her ancestors. But little Volf grew weaker each day. The other women at the fort watched her struggle with cold indifference. When she asked to borrow some honey to soothe the baby's throat, they turned away. When she needed clean cloth for fever rags, they claimed they had none to spare. Even the laundress, a kind woman who had always been friendly, began avoiding her. "It's not right," Morning Star heard one woman whisper to another. "That baby's half Indian. What if he grows up to be like his mother's people? What if he turns against us?" "Better that such children don't survive," came the harsh reply. "It's nature's way of keeping the races separate." Morning Star pretended not to hear, but each word cut deep. These people had welcomed her when she could be useful, when she could cook and clean and help with their children. But now, when she needed help most, they showed their true feelings. December 21st was the longest night of the year, and it brought a blizzard that howled around the fort like angry spirits. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind found every crack in the walls. Morning Star sat by the small stove in her corner of the barracks, holding little Volf close to her chest. His breathing was so weak she had to put her ear to his mouth to make sure he was still alive. That night, Sergeant Cross had been drinking with 3 other soldiers in the far corner of the barracks. Their voices grew louder as the whiskey flowed, and their talk turned ugly. Morning Star tried not to listen, but their words carried across the room. "That Indian woman's baby has been crying for weeks," Cross slurred, "keeping honest soldiers awake with his wailing. Should never have let her stay here in the first place," agreed Private Murphy, a young man from Pennsylvania who usually kept to himself. "Indians don't belong with civilized folk." "The baby's sick," said Private Henderson, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe we should ... "Should what?" Cross interrupted. "Waste our medicine on a half-breed? That child's going to grow up to be our enemy anyway. Better to deal with the problem now." Morning Star's blood turned cold. She pulled little Volf closer, feeling his tiny heart beating against her chest like a frightened bird. She thought about running, but where could she go? The storm was too fierce, and she had no horse, no supplies. Besides, she was weak from weeks of little sleep and worry. The men's voices dropped to whispers, but she could see them looking in her direction. Cross was gesturing with his bottle, his face red with drink and hatred. The other men nodded along, caught up in his poisonous words. As the night wore on, Morning Star dozed fitfully, still holding her son. She dreamed of her childhood, of riding horses across endless grasslands with her father, of a time when the world made sense and she knew where she belonged. She woke to find tears on her cheeks and snow still pounding against the windows. Little Volf had grown very still in her arms. His fever had broken, but instead of relief, she felt terror. He was too quiet, too pale. She whispered his name and felt the faintest breath against her cheek. He was alive, but barely. Outside she could hear voices through the storm. Someone was moving around the fort, and she caught fragments of conversation. Cross was talking to someone, their words lost in the wind. Morning Star pulled her blanket tighter around herself and her baby, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. She was right to be afraid. The longest night of the year was about to become the darkest moment of her life, setting in motion events that would echo across the Texas plains for years to come. In her arms, little Volf stirred, slightly, unaware that his short life was about to become the spark that would ignite a fire of vengeance, unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. Swift Arrow had been watching the fort for 3 days when he witnessed the unthinkable. Hidden in the shadows beyond the wooden walls, the young Comanche scout had come to check on Morning Star, as he had promised her father he would do throughout the winter. What he saw that terrible night would haunt him for the rest of his life. The blizzard had been fierce, but native eyes were trained to see through darkness and storm. Swift Arrow watched as the drunken soldiers dragged Morning Star from her corner of the barracks. He heard her desperate screams as they tore the sick baby from her arms. He saw them throw the child out into the freezing night like a piece of garbage. Laughing as they did it, every instinct told him to attack, to try to save the innocent child, but Swift Arrow was one man against dozens of armed soldiers. His training as a scout had taught him patience and wisdom. Sometimes the most important thing a warrior could do was live to carry the truth to those who could act upon it. He waited until dawn, watching Morning Star search frantically in the snow until she found her son's small, frozen body. Her wails of grief carried across the prairie like the cry of a wounded eagle. Swift Arrow felt each sob like a knife in his own heart. He had failed in his duty to protect her, and now an innocent child was dead. As soon as the storm broke, Swift Arrow mounted his horse and began the hardest ride of his life. The winter camp of Chief Ironwolf lay 2 days away across frozen rivers and snow-covered plains. His horse was strong, but the weather was brutal. Ice crystals formed on his eyebrows and the animal's mane as they pushed through snowdrifts that sometimes reached their bellies. Swift Arrow had known Ironwolf since childhood. The chief was his uncle, his mother's older brother, and the man who had taught him to track deer through thick forest and read weather signs in cloud formations. Ironwolf was 53 years old and had led their band through countless battles and negotiations with both enemy tribes and white settlers. His wisdom was legendary, but so was his fierce protection of family. The scout's horse stumbled several times on the treacherous trail, and once they broke through ice on a creek, soaking Swift Arrow's legs in water so cold it felt like fire. But he pressed on, knowing that every hour of delay meant Ironwolf would be that much further from being able to act on the terrible news. On the second day, as the sun was setting behind gray clouds, Swift Arrow finally saw the smoke from the winter camp's fires rising above a grove of bare cottonwood trees. The camp was well hidden in a valley that provided shelter from the worst winds, with good water from a spring that never quite froze. About 60 people lived there during the cold months, including warriors, elders, women, and children. As Swift Arrow rode into camp, people came out of their tippahs to greet him. They could see from his face and the condition of his horse that he brought serious news. Children stopped playing and gathered behind their mother's skirts. Even the camp dogs seemed to sense the tension and fell silent. Chief Ironwolf emerged from his tipi before Swift Arrow could dismount. The chief was a tall man with graying hair that he wore in 2 long braids decorated with eagle feathers earned in battle. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by years of sun and wind, but his dark eyes were still sharp as flint. 3 parallel scars ran down his left cheek, souvenirs from a fight with a grizzly bear when he was young. "Uncle," Swift Arrow sighed, sliding from his exhausted horse. "I bring terrible news about Morning Star." Ironwolf's expression didn't change, but Swift Arrow saw his jaw tighten slightly. The chief had been deeply hurt when his daughter chose to marry a white soldier, but family was family, blood was blood. Whatever differences they had didn't change the fact that she was his firstborn child, the little girl who had once followed him everywhere and insisted on learning to use a bow alongside her brothers. "Come," Ironwolf said simply, "we will talk inside." The chief's tipi was warm and comfortable, with buffalo robes covering the ground and a small fire crackling in the center. Ironwolf's wife, Gentle Rain, was mending a pair of moccasins by the firelight. She looked up as they entered, saw the expression on Swift Arrow's face, and quietly set her work aside. Swift Arrow told his story carefully, leaving out no detail. He described the cruel laughter of the soldiers, Morning Star's desperate attempts to save her child, and the sight of the tiny frozen body in the snow. As he spoke, Ironwolf sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his face showing no emotion, but Swift Arrow knew his uncle well. He could see the fury building behind those calm eyes, like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Gentle Rain covered her mouth with her hand when she heard about her grandson's death, tears streaming down her cheeks. When Swift Arrow finished speaking, silence filled the tipi except for the crackling of the fire. Ironwolf stared into the flames for a long time, and Swift Arrow could almost see the thoughts moving behind his eyes like shadows. Finally, Ironwolf spoke. "My grandson had a name. What was it?" "Little Wolf," Swift Arrow replied. "Morning Star called him Little Wolf." The chief nodded slowly. Little Wolf, he was innocent. He had done no harm to anyone. They killed him because he was part Comanche, because they saw him as their enemy before he could even walk. Iron Wolf stood and walked to a wooden box where he kept his most precious possessions. From it, he pulled a small shirt made of soft deerskin, decorated with blue and white beads. Gentle Rain had made it for their grandson, hoping that someday Morning Star would bring the child to visit. "I made this for him," Gentle Rain whispered. "I dreamed he would wear it when he took his first steps." Iron Wolf held the tiny shirt for a moment, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the box. When he turned around, his face had changed. The gentle grandfather was gone, replaced by the war chief who had defended his people for 30 years. "Send word to my war council," he told Swift Arrow, "all of them, tonight." Word spread quickly through the camp, and within an hour 8 of Iron Wolf's most trusted warriors had gathered in his tipi. These were men who had fought beside him in dozens of battles, who knew his thoughts almost before he spoke them. There was Charging Bear, Iron Wolf's younger brother, quick-tempered but loyal to death. Gray Hawk, the best tracker in the tribe, who could follow a trail 3 days old across solid rock. Running Horse, barely 25 but already famous for his skill with a rifle. And others, each chosen for their courage and wisdom. Iron Wolf told them what had happened, his voice steady and calm. But as he spoke, the warriors' faces grew dark with anger. Several reached for their weapons instinctively. Charging Bear was the first to speak when the chief finished. "Brother, we must strike immediately," he said, his voice tight with rage. "Every day we wait, those murderers grow more comfortable. They must pay for this crime." "With what?" asked Gray Hawk ever. "Practical. A raid against a fort full of soldiers. We are 8 men, not 80. We would be killed, and our deaths would accomplish nothing. Then we gather more warriors," suggested Running Horse. "Call in fighters from the other bands. Make this a war they'll never forget." Iron Wolf listened to each man speak, weighing their words carefully. Some wanted immediate revenge, no matter the cost. Others counseled caution, worried about bringing the full might of the army down on their people. The youngest warriors spoke of honor and blood debt. The older ones talked about the safety of the women and children in Camp. As the discussion continued, Iron Wolf remained silent, turning something over in his mind. Finally, he raised his hand for quiet. "You all speak with brave hearts," he said, "but this is not about revenge. This is about justice. There is a difference." He stood and began to pace slowly around the fire, his shadow dancing on the tipi. "Walls. If we attack the fort, innocent people will die alongside the guilty. Soldiers who had nothing to do with my grandson's murder will be killed. That is revenge, not justice. If we gather a war party and raid the settlements, we will kill farmers and their families who never harmed us. Again, revenge, not justice." The warriors listened intently. Iron Wolf was known for his careful thinking, for seeing solutions where others saw only problems. "The men who killed Little Wolf have names," Iron Wolf continued. "They have faces. They made a choice to murder an innocent child, and they laughed while they did it. Those men, and only those men, must answer for what they've done." "But how do we find them?" asked Gray Hawk. "How do we reach them?" Iron Wolf stopped pacing and looked at each warrior in turn. "The same way a wolf hunts elk, patiently, carefully. We learn everything about them, where they go, what they do. When they are vulnerable, then we strike, not like raiders, but like the hand of justice itself." Charging Bear shifted uncomfortably. "Brother, you're talking about a long hunt. These men might scatter to different places, different forts. It could take months, even years." "Then it takes years," Iron Wolf replied firmly. "My grandson was murdered. That debt will be paid, no matter how long it takes, no matter how far we must travel. I swear this by the spirits of our ancestors and by the memory of Little Wolf." The warriors murmured their agreement. They had seen their chief make such vows before, and they knew he would keep this one if it took the rest of his life. Spring arrived like a gentle promise across the Texas plains. The harsh winter that had claimed Little Wolf's life slowly gave way to warmer days and longer sunlight. Wildflowers began to bloom in patches of yellow and purple, and the rivers ran full with melted snow. But for Iron Wolf, the changing season brought no peace. only a clearer path for the justice he had sworn to deliver. For 3 months, Swift Arrow had been watching and waiting near Fort Richardson, living like a ghost in the wilderness surrounding the military post. He had learned to move so quietly that even the fort's dogs didn't sense his presence. From hidden spots in the rocks and brush, he observed the daily routines of the soldiers, memorizing their faces and learning their names. The information he gathered was disturbing. Sergeant Cross, the leader of the group that had murdered Little Wolf, showed no remorse for what he had done. Instead, he bragged about it to other soldiers, calling it one less savage to worry about. The other 3 men involved seemed less proud of their actions, but none of them had spoken against Cross or reported the crime to their officers. Swift Arrow had also learned something that made Iron Wolf's heart burn with cold fury. The fort's doctor had actually been willing to treat Little Wolf, but Colonel Hartwell had forbidden it, saying medicine was too precious to waste on half-breeds. Morning Star had begged and pleaded, offering to work for free in exchange for help, but the colonel had turned her away. When Swift Arrow brought this news to the winter camp, Iron Wolf listened in silence. His wife, Gentle Rain, wept openly when she heard how her daughter had been treated. But Iron Wolf's face remained like stone, though his hands clenched into fists. The doctor was not evil, Swift Arrow reported. I could see in his eyes that he wanted to help, but he was afraid of the colonel. The colonel is the one who created the poison that killed my cousin's child. Iron Wolf nodded slowly. Justice would need to be precise, like a surgeon's knife, cutting out only the diseased parts while leaving the healthy tissue untouched. As spring turned toward summer, Iron Wolf began gathering the information he would need for his hunt. Through a network of traders, scouts, and friendly Indians who worked around various forts, he learned the movements and plans of the men responsible for his grandson's death. Sergeant Cross had been transferred to a small outpost called Cedar Creek Station, about 100 miles south of Fort Richardson. The post was built to protect settlers traveling along the Brazos River, but it was poorly constructed and lightly defended. Only 12 soldiers were stationed there, living in rough wooden buildings surrounded by a fence that wouldn't stop a determined dog, much less a Comanche war party. Private Henderson, one of Cross's accomplices, had finished his service with the army and returned to his family's farm near the town of Weatherford. He was trying to live quietly, raising crops and avoiding talk about his time as a soldier. But guilt followed him like a shadow, and neighbors noticed that he drank too much and jumped at loud noises. Private Davis had also left the army and moved to Austin, where he worked in a general store and tried to forget his past. He had married a local woman and seemed to be building a normal life, but Swift Arrow's contacts reported that he often had nightmares and would wake up screaming about a baby crying in the snow. Only Private Murphy remained at Fort Richardson, now under the protection of increased guards who had been stationed there after reports of Indian activity in the area. Murphy knew he was being hunted, and the knowledge was slowly driving him insane. He barely slept, ate little, and flinched every time someone approached him unexpectedly. Iron Wolf decided to begin with Sergeant Cross. The man was isolated at his small outpost, away from the main army forces that might come to his aid. More importantly, Cross was the leader, the one who had made the decision to kill Little Wolf. His death would send a message to the others that Iron Wolf's justice was real and unstoppable. Choosing his war party was a careful process. Iron Wolf selected 11 of his best warriors, men who could move silently and strike without warning. Among them was his brother Charging Bear, whose anger at the child's murder burned as hot as Iron Wolf's own. There was Gray Hawk, whose tracking skills were legendary, and Running Horse, whose steady nerves and quick thinking had saved many lives in battle. But this would not be like the old raids against enemy tribes or Mexican settlements. This was a precision mission that required them to travel deep into settled territory, avoid detection by army patrols, and strike at a specific target without harming innocent people. The journey to Cedar Creek Station took them through country that was becoming increasingly dangerous for Indians. White settlers had built farms and towns across land that had been Comanche hunting grounds for generations. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than the swiftest horse, and railroads brought soldiers and supplies to places that had once been safely remote. Iron. Volf led his warriors along forgotten trails that wound through creek beds and hidden valleys. They traveled mostly at night, covering their tracks and avoiding the main roads where they might encounter patrols or settlers. During the day they rested in caves or thick groves of trees, posting guards and keeping their horses quiet. The war party lived off the land as their ancestors had taught them, eating roots and berries, catching fish from streams, and occasionally taking a deer when they were far from any settlement. They spoke in whispers and hand signals, communicating like wolves hunting in a pack as they drew closer to Cedar Creek Station. Iron Wolf sent Greyhawk ahead to scout the outpost and learn its defenses. The tracker was gone for 2 days, moving through the countryside like a shadow, observing everything and being seen by no one. When Greyhawk returned, his report was encouraging. The outpost was even more poorly defended than Swift Arrow had indicated. The wooden walls were cracked and poorly maintained, with gaps large enough for a man to slip through. The soldiers had grown lazy and careless, confident that no Indians would dare attack so close to settled areas. "Cross is there," Greyhawk reported. "I saw him clearly. He has grown fat and soft since leaving Fort Richardson. The other soldiers don't seem to respect him much. I heard them talking, and they think he drinks too much and tells too many stories about his battles with Indians." Iron Wolf smiled grimly. Pride and carelessness were weaknesses that a wise warrior could exploit. For 3 days, the Comanche war party watched Cedar Creek Station from concealed positions in the surrounding hills. They learned the guards' routines, noting when they changed shifts and when they were most likely to be distracted. They observed which buildings Cross used and where he slept. The soldiers at the outpost had no idea they were being watched. They went about their daily duties, complaining about the heat and the poor food, playing cards in the evening and telling stories around their campfires. Cross was indeed unpopular with his men, who saw him as a bully and a braggart. Iron Wolf chose the night of the new moon for his attack. In the darkness before dawn, when human senses are at their dullest and guards are most likely to be drowsy, the Comanche warriors moved like spirits through the night. They had painted their faces with traditional war paint, not for intimidation, but as a spiritual preparation for the justice they were about to deliver. Iron Wolf wore the colors of the earth and sky, marking himself as an instrument of natural law rather than human vengeance. The attack was swift and silent. Greyhawk slipped through one of the gaps in the wooden wall and quietly disabled the guard, knocking him unconscious without killing him. Running Horse and 2 other warriors secured the weapons shed, preventing the soldiers from arming themselves quickly if they were awakened. Iron Wolf and Charging Bear moved directly toward the building where Cross slept. The sergeant had his own small room, a privilege of his rank that would now become his downfall. The door was secured with only a simple wooden latch, easily opened by someone who knew how to move quietly. Cross was sleeping heavily, snoring loudly. After drinking too much whiskey the night before, Iron Wolf stood over him for a moment, looking down at the man who had thrown his grandson into the freezing snow. In the dim light, Cross looked older and softer than he had at Fort Richardson. But Iron Wolf felt no pity for him when Cross opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Iron Wolf's painted face looking down at him. For a moment, confusion clouded his features as if he thought he was having a nightmare. Then reality struck him, and his face went white with terror. "You," Cross whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "You're him, the chief, the baby's grandfather." Iron Wolf nodded slowly. "I am Iron Wolf. You killed my grandson, Little Wolf. You threw him into the snow to die, and you laughed while you did it." Cross tried to reach for the pistol beside his bed, but Charging Bear's knife was already at his throat, the blade pressing just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "Please," Cross begged, his brave words from Fort Richardson forgotten now, that he faced real consequences for his actions. "It wasn't my idea. The colonel, he said the medicine was too valuable. We were just following orders." "You were not ordered to throw a sick baby into a blizzard," Iron Wolf replied calmly. The was your choice. You chose cruelty when you could have chosen mercy. Now you will face the consequences of that choice. News of Sergeant Cross's death spread across the Texas frontier like wildfire in dry grass. The discovery of his body at Cedar Creek Station sent shockwaves through every military post and settlement from the Red River to the Rio Grande. This wasn't a random Indian raid or a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more frightening, something personal and calculated. The message left behind, carved into a piece of bark and placed on Cross's chest, made it clear that this was an act of targeted revenge. Justice for Little Wolf meant nothing to most people who read it, but those who had been at Fort Richardson during the winter understood immediately. Someone had come for Cross because of what he had done to Morning Star's baby. Colonel Hartwell received the news by telegraph 3 days after the attack. He read the message twice, his hands shaking slightly as the implications became clear. He remembered the Indian woman and her sick child, remembered turning away the fort's doctor when she begged for help. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable decision, saving valuable medicine for soldiers and their families. Now, sitting in his office with the telegraph message in his hands, Hartwell realized he had made a terrible mistake. By refusing to help an innocent child, he had set in motion a chain of events that could endanger everyone under his command. The colonel immediately called for Private Murphy, one of the 3 remaining men who had been involved in the child's death. Murphy arrived within minutes, his face pale and his hands trembling. He had lost 20 pounds since winter, and dark circles under his eyes showed that he hadn't been sleeping well. "Sir, you wanted to see me?" Murphy's voice cracked. As he spoke, "Cross is dead," Hartwell said bluntly. "Killed by Indians at Cedar Creek Station. They left a message about justice for someone called Little Wolf." Murphy's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He had to grab the back of a chair to keep from falling. "The baby," he whispered. "They're coming for us because of the baby." Hartwell nodded grimly. "I'm assigning extra guards to watch you at all times, and I'm sending word to the other posts to be on alert. If they came for Cross, they'll come for the rest of you too." But Iron Wolf was already moving faster than the armies. Messages could travel. While telegraph operators tapped out warnings and cavalry units prepared to search for the mysterious attackers, the Comanche chief was already closing in on his second target, Private. Henderson had tried to build a quiet life on his family's farm near Weatherford, but guilt had followed him home from the war. His wife noticed how he would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, calling out apologies to someone she couldn't see. His children learned to stay quiet when their father had been drinking, because loud noises made him angry and unpredictable. Henderson's farm was small but well tended, with fields of corn and cotton that he worked from sunrise to sunset. The physical labor helped quiet his mind during the day, but at night, when darkness fell and the wind whistled through the trees, he would remember the sound of a baby crying and a mother's desperate screams. He had told his wife that he had nightmares about battles he had fought in, but that wasn't the whole truth. The image that haunted him most wasn't of enemy soldiers or dangerous raids. It was the memory of Morning Star's face as she watched them throw her child into the snow. Henderson had tried to stop them, had grabbed Cross's arm and said they shouldn't do it, but he hadn't fought hard enough to save the baby. Iron Wolf had been watching Henderson's farm for a week, learning the family's routines and waiting for the right moment. The chief felt no anger toward Henderson's wife and children, who had done nothing wrong. This was about justice, not revenge, and justice required precision. The farm was isolated, sitting at the end of a dirt road that wound through thick woods. Henderson's nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away, far enough that screams wouldn't carry. Iron Wolf had brought only 3 warriors with him this time, wanting to keep the group small and fast-moving on a hot July evening when the cicadas were singing in the oak trees and fireflies danced above the creek. Henderson was working alone in his cornfield, cutting weeds with a long-handled hoe. His wife was inside preparing supper, and his 2 young children were playing in the yard behind the house. Iron Wolf approached from the woods, moving silently between the rows of corn until he was close enough to see the sweat on Henderson's face. The former soldier had grown thin from hard work and worry, and his hair was already showing gray streaks. though he was only 28 years old. When Henderson looked up and saw the painted Comanche chief standing 10 feet away, he didn't run or cry out. Instead, he simply dropped his hoe and sank to his knees in the dirt. "You're here for me," Henderson said quietly. "Because of the baby," Ironvolf nodded. "You were there. You helped throw my grandson into the snow to die." "I tried to stop them," Henderson said, tears streaming down his face. I grabbed Cross's arm, told him it was wrong. "But I wasn't strong enough, I wasn't brave enough, I should have fought harder." "Yes," Ironvolf agreed. "You should have." Henderson looked toward his house, where his own children were playing in the evening light. "My little ones," he whispered. "They don't understand why their father has been so sad. I wanted to tell them the truth someday, when they were old enough. I wanted them to know that I was a coward and that good men don't stand by when innocent. People are hurt." Ironvolf felt a strange respect for this broken man who at least understood the weight of his failure. But understanding didn't erase the debt that needed to be paid. "Your children will grow up without their father, as my daughter must live without her son," Ironvolf said. "That is the price of your cowardice." Henderson nodded and closed his eyes. "Tell them I'm sorry," he whispered. "Tell them their father was sorry." When Henderson's wife found his body the next morning, she also found a message written in charcoal on a wooden fence post: "Justice for little Volf." She didn't understand what it meant, but she understood that her husband's past had finally caught up with him. The news of Henderson's death reached the authorities within days, and the pattern became clear. Someone was systematically hunting down the men who had been involved in the death of an Indian baby. The territorial governor issued orders for increased patrols, and rewards were posted for information about the mysterious attackers, but Ironvolf was already moving toward his third target. Private Davis had traveled the farthest from his past, settling in Austin and trying to disappear into the growing city. He worked in a general store owned by a German immigrant, married a schoolteacher named Anna, and rented a small house near the Colorado River. To his neighbors, he seemed like a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself, but Davis's dreams were filled with the same images that haunted Henderson. The crying baby, the desperate mother, the sound of small body hitting the snow. He had started going to church every Sunday, sitting in the back pew and praying for forgiveness that never seemed to come. His wife worried about his drinking and the way he would stare out the window for hours, as if watching for something terrible approaching. Finding Davis had required Ironvolf to use all his network of contacts. Austin was a real city with hundreds of people and busy streets that made tracking difficult. But Swift Arrow had spent weeks asking careful questions, following leads, and watching from hidden spots until he located the former soldier. Ironvolf arrived in Austin during the hottest part of summer, when the air shimmered with heat and even the lizards sought shade. He had left most of his war party camped outside the city, bringing only Gray Hawk with him for this mission. 2 Indians could move through a city more easily than a large group, especially if they were careful and patient. Davis's house was small and neat, with a vegetable garden in the back and curtains in the windows. Ironvolf watched it for 3 days, learning when Davis left for work, when his wife went to the market, and when they were alone. The waiting was hard, but Ironvolf had learned patience during his years as a leader. On a Tuesday morning, Anna Davis left early to visit her sister across town. Davis had stayed home because he wasn't feeling well, complaining of headaches and stomach pains that his wife blamed on too much whiskey. Ironvolf knew these weren't physical ailments, but the effects of a guilty conscience eating away at a man's soul. The front door was unlocked, a sign of the trust people felt in their growing city. Ironvolf entered quietly, finding Davis sitting at his kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. Davis looked up when he heard footsteps, and his face went completely white when he saw the Comanche chief standing. In his doorway, he didn't seem surprised, just tired and sad. "I've been expecting you," Davis said quietly. "Ever since I heard about Cross and Henderson, I knew you'd come for me too." "You remember what you did?" Ironvolf said. Davis nodded. "I remember everything. The baby's face, The way his mother screamed. I've been carrying it with me every day since it happened. He gestured around his small, neat kitchen. I tried to build a good life, tried to make up for what I did. But you can't really make up for something like that, can you? No, Ironvolf agreed. Some acts cannot be undone. Winter had returned to the Texas plains, bringing with it memories of the terrible night 1 year ago when little Volf had died in the snow. The anniversary weighed heavily on everyone at Fort Richardson, but none more so than Private Murphy, the last surviving member of the group that had committed the unthinkable crime. Murphy had become a ghost of his former self. Once a sturdy young man from Pennsylvania, he now appeared decades older than his 24 years. His hands shook constantly, he jumped at the smallest sounds, and his eyes darted nervously around every room he entered. The other soldiers had begun avoiding him, partly from fear that Ironvolf's vengeance might strike anyone nearby, and partly because Murphy's terror was contagious. Colonel Hartwell had done everything possible to protect his remaining soldier. Murphy was never allowed outside the fort alone, ate only food prepared by the army cooks, and slept in a room with 2 guards posted outside his door. Extra patrols circled the fort day and night, and sentries had orders to shoot any Indian on sight, but these precautions only made Murphy more anxious. He knew, as everyone at the fort knew, that Ironvolf had somehow reached Cross at his isolated outpost, Henderson on his guarded farm, and Davis in the middle of a busy city. Walls and guards hadn't stopped the Comanche chief before, and they wouldn't stop him now. Dr. Morrison, the fort's physician, had tried to help Murphy with laudanum for his nerves, but the young soldier refused all medicine. "I don't deserve to feel better," he would say. "I helped kill a baby. I deserve to suffer." The doctor was one of the few people who showed Murphy any kindness. Morrison had carried his own guilt for a year, knowing that if he had been braver, if he had defied the colonel's orders and treated little Volf, the child might still be alive. He understood Murphy's torment because he shared it. "You can't bring the child back by destroying yourself," Morrison told Murphy during one of their conversations. "The only thing you can do now is find a way to live with what happened and try to be a better man." But Murphy shook his head. "How can I be better when I let them throw a sick baby into a blizzard? How can I live with that? Sometimes I think it would be easier if the chief would just come and finish this." Morrison had no answer for that. Some guilt was too heavy for one person to carry, and Murphy's burden seemed to be crushing him slowly, day by day, as winter deepened. Reports came in from across the territory about increased Indian activity. Settlers reported seeing smoke signals in the distance, horses stolen from remote ranches, and warriors spotted on hilltops watching the movements of patrol units. The territorial government sent additional troops to Fort Richardson, turning it into a small fortress bristling with weapons and nervous energy, but Ironvolf was not planning another raid or preparing for battle. He had spent the months since Davis's death in careful thought and preparation, waiting for the right moment to complete his quest. The anniversary of his grandson's death would mark the end of his hunt, bringing the story full circle. On a cold December morning, exactly 1 year after little Volf's murder, a lone figure appeared on the ridge overlooking Fort Richardson, Iron. Volf sat motionless on his warhorse, clearly visible to the sentries, making no attempt to hide. He wore his finest clothes, his face painted with the symbols of justice and completion. The fort exploded into activity. Soldiers ran to their positions, officers shouted orders, and weapons were loaded and aimed at the solitary figure on the hill, but Ironvolf made no aggressive moves. He simply sat and waited, patient as stone. Colonel Hartwell climbed to the fort's highest watchtower with a telescope, studying the Indian chief who had haunted his dreams for a year. Ironvolf was older than the colonel had expected, perhaps in his 50s, with gray streaking his long black hair. But there was something in his posture, in the way he held himself, that spoke of power and absolute determination. "What does? He's come to finish what he started." The colonel called for Murphy, who arrived within minutes, his face pale but strangely calm. For the first time in months, his hands weren't shaking. Seeing Ironvolf on the ridge seemed to have brought him a kind of peace, the peace that comes when long-dreaded news finally arrives. "He's here for me?" Murphy said quietly, looking through the telescope at the distant figure. "You're under my protection," Hartwell replied firmly. "He can't touch you here." Murphy laughed bitterly. "Colonel," he reached across at his outpost, Henderson on his farm, and Davis in Austin. "Do you really think these walls will stop him?" The standoff continued for hours. Ironwolf remained on the ridge, unmoving as a statue, while the fort's defenders watched him nervously. Some soldiers suggested shooting him, but Hartwell knew that killing Iron Wolf would only bring the full fury of the Comanche nation down on the fort. The chief had been careful to target only the men responsible for his grandson's death. If the army killed him, his warriors would seek revenge against everyone. As afternoon turned to evening, a white flag appeared at the fort's main gate. A civilian trader named Pete Wilson, who had dealt fairly with various Indian tribes for years, approached under the protection of the flag of truce. He carried a message from Iron Wolf. "The chief wants to parley," Wilson told Colonel Hartwell. "He says he'll meet with you alone, halfway between the fort and the ridge, to discuss terms." "What terms?" Hartwell asked. "He wants the man who helped kill his grandson. In exchange, he promises that no other soldier at this fort will be harmed, and his warriors will not attack any settlements in this area." Hartwell felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. He had sworn an oath to protect his soldiers, but he also had a responsibility to the civilians in the surrounding area. If he refused Iron Wolf's offer, the chief might gather a large war party and bring devastation to the entire region. "I need time to think," Hartwell said. "He'll wait until tomorrow morning," Wilson replied, "but no longer. If you don't give him an answer by sunrise, he says the talking will be over." That night, the fort was quieter than it had been in months. Soldiers spoke in whispers, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Murphy sat in his room, staring out the window at the distant ridge where Iron Wolf waited in the darkness. Dr. Morrison came to visit him, bringing a cup of hot coffee and some hardtack biscuits. "You should eat something," the doctor said. Murphy shook his head. "I won't be needing food much longer." "The colonel won't surrender you," Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're his soldier. He has a duty to protect you." "The colonel has a duty to everyone in this area," Murphy replied. "How many innocent people will die if Iron Wolf starts a war because of me? How many children will become orphans because I helped murder a baby?" Morrison sat down heavily in the rooms. "Only chair? I should have tried harder to save that child. If I had been braver, if I had stood up to the colonel, maybe none of this would have happened." "Maybe," Murphy agreed. "But it did happen, and now we have to live with the consequences. Or in my case, die with them?" The two men sat in silence. For a while, each lost in his own thoughts. Outside, they could hear the sentries walking their posts and the occasional whinny of horses in the stable. Normal sounds of fort life, but tonight they seemed strangely final. As dawn approached, Murphy made his decision. He couldn't live with the guilt anymore, and he couldn't bear the thought of innocent people dying because of his cowardice. Before the colonel could respond to Iron Wolf's ultimatum, Murphy would respond himself. He left his room quietly, slipping past the guards who had grown careless during the long night. The sentries at the main gate were watching the ridge, not the interior of the fort, and Murphy was able to reach the gate without being detected. Taking a deep breath, Murphy unbarred the heavy wooden gate and stepped out into the cold morning air. Behind him, he heard shouts of alarm as the guards realized what was happening. In front of him, he could see Iron Wolf descending from the ridge, riding slowly toward the fort. Murphy walked steadily forward, unarmed and unafraid for the first time in a year. He had made his choice, and there was peace in finally accepting the consequences of his actions. Iron Wolf stopped his horse about 50 yards from the fort's gate and dismounted. He walked the remaining distance, meeting Murphy halfway between the safety of the fort and the freedom of the plains. "You came out yourself?" Iron Wolf said in careful English. Murphy nodded. "I couldn't let other people die because of what I did. I helped kill your grandson, and I've been living with that guilt every day since. I'm ready to face whatever comes." Next, Iron Wolf studied the young soldier's face. He saw genuine remorse there, real understanding of the wrong that had been done. It didn't change what needed to happen, but it mattered. You were afraid for a year, Ironwolf said. Now you know how my daughter felt when you took her child from her. Yes, Murphy whispered. I understand now. What happened next was swift and final. When it was over, Ironwolf left his final message beside Murphy's body. Justice for little Wolf is complete. Colonel Hartwell found the message when he reached Murphy's body. As he read the words, he realized that Ironwolf had kept his promise. The hunt was over, the debt was paid, and the killing would stop.